Hello and welcome to this introductory video of the new NPTEL course I'm about to offer. The title of the course is The Novel and Change. My name is Avishek Parui. I'm an Associate Professor in English and Memory Studies at IIT Madras. So this is a course which will be floated from January 2025. It's a 30-hour course corresponding to 12 weeks, and it's a course about the relationship or the traffic, shall we say, between text and context. And how is the traffic determined by different kinds of discursive designs, affective apparatus, and institutional mechanisms? In other words, we're also looking at the relationship between fiction and reality. So how is fiction, the novel in particular as a genre in fiction, uniquely able to accommodate and articulate different forms of change, biological change, social change, discursive change, political change, and how all these different ecologies of change are actually entangled together in very complex, sometimes asymmetric ways. So what is the course about philosophically? So this course aims to offer a theoretical and historical understanding and a study of the novel as a genre. From the moment of inception, when it begins to rise as a major genre, as a major form of storytelling, obviously with the rise of print capitalism, and how it transitions across different moments of time in a very diachronic way, and essentially how the genre of literature, novel with all its horizontality as well as interiority, corresponds to social and cultural changes. And when I say social and cultural changes, I also mean and I allude to psychological changes. In other words, it's looking at the relationship between psyche and materiality, and how the horizontality of the novel in terms of its ability to talk about space and time in a sort of calendar way, in a temporal historical way, also crisscrosses and intersects in very complex manners with its ability to interiorize or to look inside in terms of really representing consciousness, mindfulness, memory, liminality, and all these different very complex cognitive states. So we can look at a relationship between cognition and society through different forms of change, which is what this course is about. So in a more diachronic way, the novel will be looked at as an instrument, as a vehicle in storytelling, which is also one of encoding, because it encodes different forms of information, including historical materiality, historiography, the manner in which history is written, and also dominant and marginalized forms of memory, the way those connect to different forms of storytelling and focalization. So through a very close selection of texts, we'll look at the text in a minute, and a study of the secondary references, we'll look at some of the scholarship around the selected text. This course will underline and illustrate the relevance of the novel. So why are we reading novels today? What's the unique relevance of a novel as an act of representation and also as an act of anticipation? How does a novel help us not just understanding in terms of understanding historical reality, in terms of understanding what happened in the past, but also as an anticipatory apparatus? How does a novel train us to anticipate what is about to come? So the novel as an act of representation, but equally as an act of anticipation. So the course will underline and illustrate the relevance of the novel, the unique relevance of the novel as reflective of socio-cultural moods, movements, tensions, and affirmations. So we can see how many contradictory things, many contradictory ontological, affective, psychological, cultural states will be calibrated together in very complex ways, in very asymmetric ways, and how the novel has this unique ability to really mention, like I said, articulate different forms of horizontality as well as verticality, interiority, giving you glimpses and insights into cultural conditions as well as psychological conditions, and how this helps us look at literature as a way, as a complex representation of collective and psychological situations. Literature, as an example, a representation of a collective consciousness, as a collective moment in terms of looking at a demography, looking at a certain kind of a cultural identity, either through migration, either through movements, either through different forms of political tensions, but also literature as a really unique vehicle which gives us a glimpse of the mind in terms of telling us and giving us a really good insight into how consciousness, mindfulness, memory, liminality work in very close correspondence with social, cultural, material conditions. In other words, it's a study of situatedness and how literature is uniquely able to articulate and accommodate different forms of ambivalences which correspond to different forms of situatedness. So now that we have hopefully established the flavor and the philosophical framework of the course, let's take a look at the text, which we were looking at in close details as we move along. So here we are. We start with the start in terms of looking at Robinson Crusoe by Donald Defoe as an early example of novel writing in terms of how it really becomes a very fine instance of the collusion between the rise of a novel and the rise of the merchant class. And how different forms of different themes in the novel in terms of digitalization, the rise of capitalism, the rise of the self-made man, which all these inform the plot of the novel, the character of the novel. They very complexly correspond to the cultural, social, material, political conditions of the time. In other words, the rise of classic realism as a narrative technique, as an artistic technique, as an aesthetic strategy is in very close correspondence and collusion with the socio-cultural, material, political condition at that time. We followed it up with Mary Shelley's novel Frankenstein, which may be read as a cautionary tale of man's ability to overreach, create different forms of monstrosity, which are both aspired for as well as feared. So this entire ambivalent structure in Shelley's Frankenstein in terms of overreaching, going for something superhuman, going for something outside of technological boundaries, creating something transgressive in quality, at the same time being haunted by it. And that sentimental structure is something which is really topical today as well in terms of contemporary fears of technology, contemporary fears of overreaching and trespassing and transgressing technological boundaries. Something we can talk about as we move on in this course. So we'll spend some time talking about the relevance of Frankenstein today in 2024. And of course, there's a very interesting satire and a critique from a feminist position of this very masculinist model of science, which wants to do away with ethics, morality, empathy, and all these other crucial categories which are holistic in quality. So that dangers and disastrous consequences of that kind of an epistemic training. We followed it up with Charles Dickens's novel Great Expectations, which is a novel about the empire and the inglorious identities which emerge with the functioning of the empire. So the entire idea of expectation through investment, both financial as well as emotional, how those get frustrated to different forms of insights, different forms of knowledge networks, and how the novel becomes one of cynicism from the transition from the pastoral idyllic to the slightly cannibalistic cosmopolitan, which we see in the novel is obviously very diachronic in quality, but at the same time, it is profoundly psychological in quality as well. We continue this transmission between psyche and reality and materiality, the triangulation, shall we say, the triangle between the mind, the body, and matter when it comes to Joseph Conrad's novel or novella, Heart of Darkness, which is again about the inglorious identities, the sense of shame, guilt, cynicism, which emerge at the heart of the dark underbelly of the empire. Another novel is about shame, about guilt, and in many senses also about de-territorialization. So this really speaks in a very deconstructive, dialogic way with Robinson Crusoe. So we can see how we have sequenced this text in this particular fashion. So if Robinson Crusoe happens to be a novel about territorialization, expansion, when it comes to Heart of Darkness, we see how the entire expansionist framework is beginning to get exhausted. Both at a psychological, spiritual, existential level, and also at a narratological level. So in some sense, Heart of Darkness is about the end of classic realism and the beginning of new modes of storytelling and narrative designing. Now we continue with this interplay of aspiration and anxiety and this relationship between social, material reality and psyche when we come to Arkin Narayan's novel The Guide, which is one of the finest examples in the genre of the novel really, about open-endedness, about the very porous boundaries between fact and fabulation, between a very carnivalesque comedic network and profundity. And it's a novel where different forms and templates, traditional, modern, new age, aspirational, anxious templates, are very interestingly enmeshed with each other in very asymmetric and yet organic ways. It's also a novel where the borders between profundity and showmanship are never clear, where the borders between mysticism and marketplace are never clear. So it's a very interesting novel about a new nation which is having a very incompatible relationship with a very ancient civilization. So that tension between nation and civilization in terms of new anxieties and ecologies and aspirations are really interestingly illustrated in Arkin Narayan's novel, which is the way we look at it as we study the text. We have a series of other novels following this. We have Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, which is directly and graphically about change in terms of how psychological, social, and moral changes happen with new forms of territorialization, the arrival of the empire, the arrival of new engines of empire, and what it does at a human collective level, psychologically as well as materially, and also how it reconfigures the moral map along a certain landscape, along a certain demography. We have a similar sentiment played out in more carnivalesque, heteroglossic, Bakhtinian ways in Gabriel Garcia Marquez's novel 100 Years of Solitude, which is obviously about magic realism. It is about a new narrative method, a new narrative design, which breaks away from classic realism, which offers new insights into the mind, into psyche, into territoriality, and all very subversive ways, all very carnivalesque ways. So this production of comedy, the production of dark comedy, magic reality in Marquez's fiction is also at a very meta level, a new method of writing, a new method of narrative design, and a new order of narrativity, which is the way we look at this novel when we study it. The final novels in this course are Sitsu Dangaremb's novel Nervous Conditions and Jhumpa Lahiri's novel The Lowland. Now both are about the female subject, about the doubly marginalized female subject, how it operates in a very agentic way to different forms of negotiations with old institutions, new institutions, and how both novels show us in a very interesting way the relationship between the collusion between the liberatory apparatus, the different forms of institutional mechanisms which promise emancipation, true migration, true mobility, can also collude back with various forms of patriarchy, various forms of oppression, various forms of marginality, and how at some level, at various levels really, the difference between emancipation, agency, and marginality are never really clear. The difference between a very conservative, oppressive template and a new age emancipatory template are actually not very clear. They can actually be entangled in very complex ways. So both novels, they have a very strong political background, but at the same time, both novels are more interested in domestic spaces, in the liminal spaces, in the small spaces, in the granularity of change, in the very atomic quality of change through osmosis, through different forms of biological, social, cultural, material transitions. So we see how we wrap up the course with Note to Change, in terms of looking at change not just through a big event model, not just through a macro model, but also through an atomic granular structure of slowness, of thickening of time, of very complex laminations of space-time, which is why fiction is so relevant in a world we live in today. So this is a long and short of the course. I hope I've given you a sufficient flavor of it in terms of making it attractive. We'll make it as interactive as possible. We have two very able teaching assistants. We have Arindam Nandi and Revati Krishnan helping us out in this course. They're very, very efficient. They're wonderful. And they will make sure, along with myself, they will make it as interactive and as interesting as possible. So I welcome you again to this new NPTEL course. I'm very excited about it. I hope you're excited already. The course Novel and Change, and I look forward to seeing and interacting with you in the times to come. Thank you.